Section 2 of My First Summer in the Sierra. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My First Summer in the Sierra by John Muir. Read by Adrian Pretzelis. Section 2. June 7. The sheep were sick last night, and many of them are still far from well, hardly able to leave camp, coughing, groaning, looking wretched and pitiful, all from eating the leaves of the blessed azalea. So at least say the shepherd and the Don. Having had but little grass since they left the plains, they are starving, and so eat anything green they can get. Sheepmen call the azalea sheep poison, and wonder what the Creator was thinking about when he made it. So desperately does sheep business blind and degrade those supposed to have a refining influence in the good old days we read of. The California sheep owner is in haste to get rich, and often does, now that pasturage costs nothing, while the climate is so favourable that no winter food supply, shelter pens or barns are required. Therefore large flocks may be kept at slight expense and large profits realised, the money invested doubling, it is claimed, every other year. This quickly acquired wealth usually creates desire for more. Then indeed the wool is drawn close down over the poor fellow's eyes, dimming or shutting out almost everything worth seeing. As for the shepherd, his case is worse still, especially in winter when he lives alone in a cabin. For although stimulated at times by hopes of one day owning a flock and getting rich like his boss, he at the same time is likely to be degraded by the life he leads, and seldom reaches the dignity or advantage or disadvantage of ownership. The degradation in his case has for cause one not far to seek. He is solitary most of the year, and solitude to most people seems hard to bear. He seldom has much good mental work or recreation in the way of books. Coming into his dingy hovel cabin at night, stupidly weary, he finds nothing to balance and level his life with the universe. No, after his dull drag all day after the sheep, he must get his supper. He is likely to slight this task, and try to satisfy his hunger with whatever comes handy. Perhaps no bread is baked. Then he just makes a few grimy flapjacks in his unwashed frying pan, boils a handful of tea, and perhaps fries a few strips of rusty bacon. Usually there are dried peaches or apples in the cabin, but he hates to be bothered with the cooking of them, just swallows the bacon and flapjacks, and depends on the genial stupefaction of tobacco for the rest. Then to bed, often without removing the clothing worn during the day. Of course his health suffers, reacting on his mind, and seeing nobody for weeks or months, he finally becomes semi-insane, or wholly so. The shepherd in Scotland seldom thinks of being anything but a shepherd. He is probably descended from a race of shepherds, and inherited a love and aptitude for the business almost as marked as that of his collie. He has but a small flock to look after, sees his family and neighbours, has time for reading in fine weather, and often carries books to the fields with which he may converse with kings. The Oriental shepherd, we read, called his sheep by name. They knew his voice and followed him. The flocks must have been small and easily managed, allowing piping on the hills and ample leisure for reading and thinking. But whatever the pleasures of sheep culture in other times and countries, the California shepherd, as far as I've seen or heard, is never quite sane for any considerable time. Of all nature's voices, bah is about all he hears. Even the howls and kyees of coyotes might be a blessing if well heard, but he hears them only through a blur of mutton and wool, and they do him no good. The sick sheep are getting well, and the shepherd is discoursing on the various poisons lurking in these high pastures. azalea, kalmia, alkali. After crossing the North Fork of the Merced, we turned to the left toward Pilot Peak, and made a considerable ascent on a rocky, brush-covered ridge to Brown's Flat, where, for the first time since leaving the plains, the flock is enjoying plenty of green grass. Mr Delaney intends to seek a permanent camp somewhere in the neighbourhood, to last several weeks. Before noon we passed Bower Cave, a delightful marble palace, not dark and dripping, but filled with sunshine, which pours into it through its wide open mouth facing the south. It has a fine, deep, clear little lake with mossy banks, embowered with broad-leaved maples, all underground, wholly unlike anything I have seen in the cave line, even in Kentucky, where a large part of the state is honeycombed with caves. This curious specimen of subterranean scenery is located on a belt of marble that is said to extend from the north end of the range to the extreme south. Many other caves occur on the belt, but none like this, as far as I have learned, combining as it does sunny outdoor brightness and vegetation with the crystalline beauty of the underworld. It is claimed by a Frenchman who has fenced and locked it, placed a boat on the lakelet, and seats on the mossy bank under the maple trees, and charges $1 admission fee. Being on one of the ways to the Yosemite Valley, a good many tourists visit it during the travel months of summer, regarding it as an interesting addition to their Yosemite wonders. Poison oak or poison ivy, Rubus diversiloba, both as a bush and a scrambler up trees and rocks, is common throughout the foothills region, up to a height of at least 3,000 feet above the sea. It is somewhat troublesome to most travellers, inflaming the skin and eyes, but blending harmoniously with its companion plants, and many a charming flower leans confidently upon it for protection and shade. I have oftentimes found the curious twining lily, Strophylaриum californicum, climbing its branches, showing no fear, but rather congenial companionship. Sheep eat it without apparent ill effects, so do horses to some extent, though not fond of it, and to many persons it is harmless. Like most other things not apparently useful to man, it has few friends, and the blind question, "Why was it made?" goes on and on with never a guess that first of all it might have been made for itself. Brown's Flat is a shallow fertile valley on the top of the divide between the North Fork of the Merced and Bull Creek, commanding magnificent views in every direction. Here the adventurous pioneer David Brown made his headquarters for many years, dividing his time between gold hunting and bear hunting. Where could lonely hunter find a better solitude? Game in the woods, gold in the rocks, health and exhilaration in the air, while the colours and cloud furniture of the sky are ever inspiring through all sorts of weather. Though sternly practical, like most pioneers, old David seems to have been uncommonly fond of scenery. Mr Delaney, who knew him well, tells me that he dearly loved to climb to the summit of a commanding ridge to gaze abroad over the forests to the snow-clad peaks and sources of the rivers, and over the foreground valleys and gulches to note where miners were at work or claims were abandoned, judging by smoke from cabins and campfires, the sound of axes, etc., and when a rifle shot was heard, to guess who was the hunter, whether Indian or some poacher, on his wide domain. His dog Sandy accompanied him everywhere, and well the little hairy mountaineer knew and loved his master and his master's aims. In deer hunting he had but little to do, trotting behind his master as he slowly made his way through the wood, careful not to step heavily on dry twigs, scanning open spots in the chaparral where the game loves to feed in the early morning and towards sunset, peering cautiously over ridges as new outlets were reached, and along the meadowy borders of streams. But when bears were hunted, little Sandy became more important, and it was as a bear hunter that Brown became famous. His hunting method, as described by Mr Delaney, who had passed many a night with him in his lonely cabin and learned his stories, was simply to go slowly and